Hi, my name is Brooks Fisher, and in this video I want to show you how I make a reed from start to finish. So let's get started. I have a blank here that I just tied, and I'm going to start with an even amount of cane off from left to right just to remove the bark. And I'm going to get past the bark and past that layer that sort of looks chalky, what I would consider sort of the second layer, into the third layer. I'm going to do that on both sides. At which point I'm going to switch to a different stroke, because I want to really avoid taking off a corner or taking off a side at this point. That would be disastrous. And I apologize for my unprofessional light setup, but I just want you to be able to see me and see the reed, so I think you can do that. So what I'm going to do next is, in my mind, cut the reed in half and cut those halves again into half. And I'm going to, just with my knife perpendicular to the reed, go up in a straight line in each of those quadrants of the reed. And this is going to create a sort of W. And the reason we're doing this, instead of just starting the V, is, like I said, I just really want to avoid the sides and the center. I've already sort of taken off the first few layers from the middle of the reed, so I want to start avoiding it now if I can. Let me sharpen my knife. So I'll go a little bit further, and then it's ready to clip open. I haven't figured out how to clip on camera yet, because the camera sort of gets in the way, so I hope you can forgive me for clipping off screen. And I'm really wanting to take out a lot of cane here before I clip the reed, because I think it's going to save me a lot of time later. It's also going to mean I don't have to have the plaque in as long, and I think that can contribute to less tight sides. Okay, so we're clipped open now. It's not a really large opening, but it's not absolutely tiny. What I'm going to do next is click the reed into place. And what I mean by that is I'm going to take this top blade and move it over to the right, and this bottom blade I'm going to move it over to the left. And because the reed is slipped at the bottom and attached at the top, it's sort of, the blades are right on top of each other on top. And when I shift it over, hopefully it's going to shift over with such force that it's actually going to make a noise, a click. And let's see if we can hear that. Yeah, it made a pretty pronounced, high-pitched click. And what that means is the reed should be very tight, the sides should be very tight, and the plaque should actually be difficult to put in. And one of my biggest pet peeves is people who put the plaque in about this far or something like this. That's really going to ruin the tight sides that you hopefully made when you tied the reed. So I really only put the plaque in about this far, no further. And it's so tight I can just move this around. There's no risk. I could attach my mandrel, which is quite heavy, and that's not going anywhere. I could add probably a few pounds to this, or maybe a pound. And what that's going to allow me to do is scrape way more out of the reed without the pitch dropping. And so that's going to allow me to scrape depth and resonance and vibration into this reed without having to worry about the pitch, especially of the high notes. So let's get started. The first type of stroke I like to do is what I call a planing stroke. And we're not doing a scooping action with the wrist because that's going to create an uneven reduction of the reed. What I want to do is actually, I'm sort of drawing the reed back and keeping the knife in the same place, if you can see that. And that's going to allow me to really evenly reduce this cane in a vertical plane. Now I'm also trying to reduce the cane evenly from left to right. And what that's going to do is evenly reduce the reed and evenly reduce the gouge. And you've probably heard that before. And what is the reason for that? It's a good question, because some people like to, from the start, put in channels and leave in a spine and all these things. And I think that really complicates the matter. And what evenly reducing the gouge really does for me, I'll let other people speak on gouges in more detail, but what it allows me to do is do the same thing every single time. It's extremely easily reproducible. And if you like your gouge, why not just take layers off evenly and really reveal what the true gouge is. But for me, most importantly, I can just take off the same amount all over the reed from here down, and I can do that every single time. So I'm going to have a very consistent result. And when I'm refining, if I decide that through my objective testing that the channels need to be reduced and I need to leave something heavier in the spine, I can do that no problem. Okay, so let me sharpen my knife, and I'm going to put in a tip. So that initial stroke that we did, where we evenly reduced the tip, helped us a lot. We already have a significant amount of cane out of the middle. You can see that sort of bottleneck effect as opposed to a pencil tip. If we're looking at the tip, we don't really want it to look like this so much as this. And I can talk a lot more about that later. But since I already have some cane out of the middle, I can really just scrape out of the side. And that's going to develop that mountaintop that we're all familiar with, that V. So what I'm doing here, I actually have sort of a knife technique trick. I'm putting the plaque in, as you can see, sort of askew. And that's so at the tip of the reed, the plaque is barely sticking out and parallel to the top of the reed. And I can actually lay my knife on the plaque and use this as a fulcrum to really precisely and accurately choose the depth I want to go into the cane. So all I have to do is roll my knife down, and I'm going to be descending deeper into the cane. And this allows me to almost eliminate all worry of taking off a side. Watch now, I'll take off a side. But it really does make it a non-issue. If you're always maintaining some contact with that plaque, see the plaque just sort of ejected itself because the knife caught a little rough spot on the plaque probably. But this sort of allows me to have an incredible amount of control without worrying about cutting off a side. So I can really thin these sides incredibly thin. And that's going to help this reed just have hopefully a good sound right from the start. Possibly even without a clip, it'll sound pretty decent. Or at least not horrific. So it's already starting to make a noise, but not a very good noise, and not very vibrant. I want to just take this minute to start to talk about my sort of reed making philosophy, or the order of operations I like to use when I'm making a reed. I sort of want the high notes to be absolutely rock solid and in tune right from the start. That's important to me. I don't want to have to use any embouchure up there. And it's okay if the low notes aren't immediately extremely responsive and vibrant, because I find it's easier to unlock the low notes once you've had those high notes in place than the other way around. If you can get the high notes sitting up right away and the reed pretty much balanced, then it's easy to keep that balance and keep those low notes while you sort of get extension into your low notes. I just find that an easier way to approach it for me. So this is taking me a little longer than normal, but that's okay. Not a great multitasker. So it's quite high pitched and tight. I'm actually going to put in a back right now, right away. And the reason I'm doing that is I want the reed to be balanced right from the start. And you can't really balance a reed without all three sections, a heart, a tip, and a back, all working together simultaneously. And like I was saying with the high notes, if we get the balance right away, it shouldn't be too difficult to maintain it. And that's really what we want to do. So I'm being careful to sort of avoid the middle and avoid the rails too much, because I don't want to collapse the structure of the reed. Something I find about the back is it's not just about tone and building resonance like I think some people think of the back as. I think it's really important for lack of a better term, the mouth feel of the reed. We want to be able to really let go. And if we don't have a good back, I think it's really difficult to let go. So you can see I took a lot of cane out of the back, but it really doesn't scoop in very far from the profile. And that means that there's at least some strength left in the reed. So the reed is still quite high in pitch. It has a little bit more complexity in the crow to me, but it's really tight. And I'm expecting that, because I like to sort of put in a tip, put in a back, and then sort of drop the heart into those two until it feels balanced to me. So I have an incredible amount of control now to just drop that heart sort of evenly, one layer at a time, or even one half layer at a time. And I know I won't overshoot things and overscrape this reed, and it won't be flat. If I go too far in the vibrant direction, I just find it a lot more difficult to bring the pitch back up. So as you can see, that was not an insignificant amount of cane that came off, but it should still be relatively high in pitch. And we could actually try it at this point. I normally wouldn't, because it definitely needs a clip and some other things, but let's just get an idea of where we're at. My oboe is freezing. talking about those high notes, and I didn't really test too many high notes, so I'll do that now. I really want the high C to be the first thing that's incredibly stable and easy to play. So it's not there. It really doesn't have the good sound, especially that high C, or really any of the registers, but it sits up. And at the end of the day, what I want my reed to do is I want it to play and make a sound when I want it to make a sound. So that's response. I want it to start when it needs to start. And I want it to be in tune. And worst comes to worst, I can really do everything else that's necessary if I need to. But if those two things aren't in place, I'm going to sound objectively bad, or it's going to just be an incredible amount of work. So we're still quite high. I actually think we can sort of, the reed seems balanced to me, actually, the three sections. And I want to talk a little bit about just the very basics of balancing a reed for a second. And that is to think of these three in a direct relationship to each other in terms of thickness. And what I mean by that is, if you thin the tip, you're sort of effectively making the other two sections thicker. I hope I said that correctly. If you thin the tip, you're making the other two proportionately thicker. And if you clip the reed, you're making all three sections thicker. And I think that basic, very basic concept can help you sort of, when you're balancing, to decide how did the scrape I just did affect the reed and affect the rest of the reed, and really what can I do next. It's definitely an oversimplification and not an absolute truth by any stretch, but I think it's a reasonable starting point. Okay, so that being said, I find that the reed is actually already quite balanced, but it definitely needs a clip. But another thing I like to do is always prepare a clip, because if I just clipped it right now, I think it would become non-vibrant, because we'd be clipping into a thicker part of the tip. So because it's well balanced, I'm going to actually scrape a bit off of all three sections of the reed before I clip it, and then we'll sort of see where we're at. And again, this scrape is incredibly important, especially I find at the beginning. I can just always find more cane here from the corner where the tip starts all the way up that side of the reed. And that really always collects the reed's tone, makes it feel more manageable in the mouth, helps the tone become more mellow. And I can also take this minute to talk about the tip. And there's a basic, a really basic idea that I think if you're really honest with yourself and you do it, if you structure a reed tip in this way, it's almost difficult to have an objectively bad tone. And sorry, my video I think was stopping. And what that trick is it's super simple, and I'm sure you probably are aware of this, but I like to think of the reed in two planes, up and down and left to right. And when we move up, the tip should always get thinner. And when we move out from center, left or right, the reed should always get thinner. So the fastest rate of getting thinner would be from the middle out to the corner. And that really simple idea, if you're always getting thinner moving up and moving outward from center, I think it can make actually having a bad tone difficult to do. And that's definitely what we want. We want to make our lives as easy as possible. so we can have more brain power spent on making music. Okay, so this reed to me is really now prepared for a clip. It's less open than I'd want it to be, but that's okay. So I'll just show you, since I didn't do it on camera, how much I took off. Not an insignificant amount. But it really, I think, helped the reed sound much, much better. So the reed sounds, I mean, it doesn't have a great sound, but it sounds okay. And it feels okay. What I mean by that is it feels really quite manageable in my mouth. Like I'm not having to do too much with my embouchure. But as you heard, several notes just didn't come out that I sort of had thought would. And that's telling me that that clip helped a lot of things, but it certainly didn't help the response. And it was a pretty big clip, so we may need to thin the tip of the tip. And what I mean by that is sort of the last millimeter or last half millimeter. And that can, that can really, there's a few spots on the reed that just small amounts of cane being taken off can have a really profound effect. And the tip of the tip is one place. Another we'll talk about later, and that is, I think, what Alain Duvos would call the sort of the action spot. And we're going to find out if I have any extension in my low notes, if my low notes get deeper without having to manufacture that with my embouchure. And if they don't get deeper without me having to force them to, I might take a look at the action spot and see if I can get them deeper so I don't have to do that with my mouth. So the response is a bit better, and the reed feels relatively comfortable. Let's try those high notes, just make sure we haven't lost them. So it feels a little bit like there's a piece of cane or something in in the tip. It's sort of hissing a little bit. But the high notes seem to be okay. So let's try those low notes. Just make sure. This is one of my favorite tests, and I learned this from Alain Duvas, and it's playing an A to a G. And I want that to get deeper on its own. And let's see if we can pass this test. And I think it's beginning to pass that test. The G without a change in embouchure sounds a little bit deeper than the A. Another test that I like is to check the same thing on F sharp to E. And I always found this interval in wedding cantata, for example, to cause me some problems. So I like to test that. So the reed, I really want it to be fun to play just right from the start, because I think we sound better if we're having fun. But I do want to get a little bit more extension in those low notes, and I also want to take this minute to show you what this action spot is, or at least what I think it is. And that's really to create a more accentuated bottleneck. That's really what we're doing. And that's gonna make the reed, the tip actually vibrate a bit more separately from the rest of the reed. So we might have to take that into consideration and do some other things. But I think about the reed in the three sections, but also having sort of three fulcrums of vibration. And the first one is the most macro fulcrum, and that's from the thread all the way up. And there's a sort of a second one here when we put in that back. That's why we get that sort of nice mouthfeel when we put that back in. It seems like, ooh, the reed's now more manageable. And I think that's because now we're shifting the fulcrum up to here. And that's allowing a tighter vibration because it's sort of a smaller instrument. And really we can do the same thing. We can choose to do it or not to do it on the top here to really separate this. And I think the reason this helps the low notes is because it adds a fulcrum here that is much shorter than any of those other fulcrums. And because it's shorter, it allows us to play what would typically be flat notes, or have a tendency to be flat. We can play them much more in tune. So let's do that. Let's unlock this reed a little bit in the low register, I hope. So we're going to lay the knife right here, and I'm just going to do a few real delicate strokes. And this is the other place I was talking about that is extremely sensitive. And anything we do really is magnified here. So we can just take off a tiny bit of cane. Here in the tip of the tip I find are some of the most sensitive spots. Obviously the tip of the tip is one of the thinnest spots, but this, if it's overdone, is really not a good thing. Or at least overdone too early. So we're really going to have a lot more vibrancy, I think, in the low notes. It doesn't sound great, but that solo is kind of scary, so I've never actually played it, so, but I can imagine. But it sort of works, and that's really important, to have that confidence that the notes will come out in the low register. But this reed really needs a clip. As you can see, I've thinned the tip of the tip so much that it's actually disintegrated a little bit in these corners. And they haven't just chipped out, or at least I hope they haven't. I've actually reduced them so that they're so thin that they just sort of start to disappear. And that's okay, but what I'm going to do now is level off the tip and get a clean surface. So this reed, it's really starting to work now. And I'd probably put it away at this point. But I want to show you one last scrape before we finish. And that's a blending type of scrape from the heart to the tip. And I haven't done that at all on this reed because it really didn't need it yet. But it does need a little bit more vibration from the tip allowed into the rest of the reed. And this is going to help do that. And I do it in a very specific way. I'm not just starting behind the tip and blending it nice and softly into the tip. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start about a millimeter behind the tip, and I'm doing sort of short, choppy strokes here, if you can see that. And what that's going to do, and I'm resetting the knife in the same place every time, and what that's going to do is create a sort of terraced effect to the reed. And that's as opposed to a real smooth transition. You can think of it as like a small staircase descending into the tip. And really, the more steps you can create, the more complexity I think in your sound you'll achieve. There's other ways to get complexity, but this is certainly one. And the reason I think it does that is for this reason. The stair-like or terrace-like effect simultaneously makes the reed easier and lets the vibration transfer through the rest of the reed, but it also maintains or adds a healthy resistance. And healthy resistance is extremely important in a reed, because if it took no air to start, a solo like Tchaikovsky 4 would be just disastrous. The D flat might sound beautiful, but your C will just pop out, because the D flat is an extremely resistant note and the C is an extremely unresistant note. So you need sort of a buffer somewhere, and that can either be with your air or your embouchure, or in your reed you can have a healthy resistance. And I prefer to have that. I mean, I'm doing it in all three, but really I want to maintain that in the reed, that little buffer, that healthy resistance. We're gonna sort of meet halfway with the non-resistant C and the D flat. Sorry about that. But I think that's an okay amount of healthy resistance, because the D flat and the C to my ear matched at least somewhat. And I'll let you take a look at the reed from this angle, and I think you can see sort of that stepping down effect that I've hopefully scraped into the reed. Now what I would probably do, and I won't do it today because I think we should just leave the video, it's getting quite long, but I would probably do that again, and it would maybe necessitate a clip, because this reed will definitely need to be clipped again. Just for those people out there that like to measure their reeds. This is, I'll start it. This is just a hair over 70 right now with a 47 tube. So it definitely can be reduced some more. And the tip starts at about a little bit above 66. Okay, well, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Take care. Something I just wanted to add on, I forgot to mention, is I also want a flexibility. We're always sort of having to strike a balance between stability and flexibility in a reed. And it's really important that it has both. And I've already tested that we've got stability in the high register, but I might try and play something with larger leaps, both articulated and legato, to try and make sure that I have a reed that's flexible enough. So something like that, articulated, I really want that to be able to be played with a let-go embouchure. I don't want to have to hold anything. And then another solo I always found is really telling of how flexible your reed is the Schumann romances. See, we often can have that problem. So we really want to make sure our reed does that. And it doesn't really pass that test as well as I would like, but I think that's something I can work on tomorrow once the reed dries out. Thanks again. Take care.